Hi, this is the Keiser Report, and I am Max Keiser. Markets, finance, scandal. Yes, it's all happening all over the world. Currencies are being used as means to fund the financial speculators. They just attack the currencies. Doesn't matter where the people are. In Greece, Iceland, America, Britain, the Middle East, Asia. Doesn't matter. Every currency is now up for grabs and to be pummeled by the hedge funds and the fund funds and the not-so-fun funds and, of course, the financial terrorists. Let's get the latest updates from Stacy Herbert.
Max, hi. Well, the first headline is to set the mood, the global mood. And this is North Tyneside High Street revived by fake shopfront. So this is a town in the north of England. And they've decided that so many businesses have gone out of business that the local council, has decided to just put fake shop fronts on to make it look like the town is lively and things happening. So it still remains a corpse city. Everything is shut down. But it kind of reminds me of our global situation where the banks are recovered because the Fed has bought all their bad debts, or the economies are on the upswing because all of the stimulus packages.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of when they lead the cows to slaughter. They put them into a chute that goes back and forth. It weaves back and forth because if the cows actually saw the abattoir, they would freak out and stampede. So by putting up these fake storefronts, they're hoping that the people don't notice that their economy is sinking and that they're soon to be economically slaughtered, and that they hope they don't panic.
But speaking of perception, this takes us to the next headline. Goldman says Matt Taibbi, Zero Hedge, Louise Story, and Janet Tavakoli have become risks to its business. This is based on its latest 10Q report. Apparently, Goldman says that adverse press coverage could impact negatively on their earnings. So it's the press, not their own actions, not their own, events like selling these credit default swaps to Greece based on fictional exchange rates.
Well, Goldman is talking about truth risk to their balance sheet. In other words, if Goldman Sachs had to start being truthful, they would be at a huge risk to their balance sheet. So the question is, how will Goldman Sachs hedge themselves against having to tell the truth? Well, they would do this with more derivatives, which of course are based on more lies. So the only way Goldman is going to extricate itself from having to tell the truth is to tell more lies.
I might add that you and I on the Keiser Report here have interviewed Matt Taibbi and Janet Tavakoli. So
that's right.
You should be included in this.
Well, they don't mention this show because that would mean that they'd have to come on this show, and they'll never come on this show because they're cowards at Goldman Sachs. Cowards!
Well, here's something that I thought should be in Goldman Sachs's 10Q, the potential risks to profit. And that is Chile quake shaves 1.2 milliseconds from the day. So apparently, this giant earthquake in Chile, we had an 8.8 earthquake. Well, it moved the Earth's axis by 3 inches and shortened the day by 1.26 milliseconds. Now, if you look at this calculation I've done here, Goldman Sachs's high-frequency trading algorithms execute a trade within 0.6 milliseconds. That means they're having 2.1 fewer trades per day.
That's right. Instead of stealing $100 million from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange every day using high-frequency trading, they might only be able to steal $98.5 million a day from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange due to the fact that Earth's axis has been shifted due to the earthquake, which, gosh, all those people that are in trouble down there in Chile, I hope they realize that they're hurting Goldman Sachs for making a few extra bucks today.
Now we're going to move on to the global financial crisis, what's going on in the streets. This next headline, Greece could sell islands to cut debt, German MPs say. So these are two MPs from Angela Merkel's ruling party. And one of them, Frank Schaeffler, who's called a financial expert, well, he's quoted on the front page of Bild, the tabloid in Germany, as saying, "Sell your islands, you bankrupt Greeks, and sell the Acropolis too."
Yeah. Well, this is the old IMF slash and burn. This is the World Bank slash and burn. We've seen it in other countries before, and now we're seeing it in the Eurozone. And this is just a way for these corrupt hedge funds and politicians to get their hands on these income-producing properties. And a lot of tourists go to these Greek tourist attractions. That's income that could be going into the pockets of Wall Street bankers. You can collateralize that, sell futures against it, and spin another $500 billion in derivatives against that future income. So, of course, they want their hands on the Greek assets. The Greek people are right to be protesting. The Greek people are right to demand that the shysters, the Goldman Sachs bankers, be taken out of the picture. They should leave the country immediately, just like you would treat any terrorist.
Well, that's the point. The Greek protesters did occupy the finance ministry, and many Germans are upset about possibly having to bail them out. But the point is, all these articles are focusing on the people. They're the ones protesting, but nobody's looking at the bankers, who are the ones that should be responsible for all of this. They're the ones that did this, and quite a few politicians that enabled them and participated in these schemes.
Well, the big joke is on Germany, because as we've talked about before, most of their 6,000 tons of gold is held in New York.
2,500 tons, I might add.
In New York. It's not even in Germany. So,
okay.
You're in for a big shock there, German people.
The talk of islands takes me to another headline. Body of major developer is found in shed. So, a tragic accident, they're calling it. John O'Dolan, 51, the largest property developer in Ireland. He's been found dead in his in a shed in his backyard. But he was involved in The World, which we talked about recently on an episode of Keiser Report, where we talked about a guy who bought Great Britain, one of the islands from The World, and that his check bounced for $54 million. But in the articles about John O'Dolan, they're saying that he bought England, which, of course, England is part of Great Britain. So who's right and who's wrong? And I'm thinking that this could be the ultimate, Florida used to be, you could sell swampland in Florida. That was the original Ponzi scheme, property Ponzi scheme. But if you look at all these images of The World, it's just a clear Ponzi scheme. It's just piles of dirt out in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at this image of the so-called world development in the Gulf. It looks like Tony Soprano's worst nightmare, a bunch of holes in the ground in New Jersey where they buried all the dead bodies. I mean, that's what it looks like. I can't believe people paid how much money for these things, these sand dunes in the middle of the Gulf?
Well, this man, Safi Qureshi, in Dubai, he's in prison. He spent $54 million, or he wrote a check for $54 million. According to the article about John O'Dolan, he bought England for 23.5 million euros.
Central bankers, you've got to stop giving all these psychopaths unlimited credit cards. They're nuts.
But the point is of that article is to look at the fact that these two men thought they owned the same island, which is England.
Right.
So, but this takes me to
Who really owns England now?
The Queen.
Manchester United? No, actually, I heard that Malcolm Glazer, they're trying to force him out of Manchester United, that interloper.
That takes me to the next headline. Indonesian mob wants blood after Treasury Secretary spends a fortune bailing out banks. This is a headline from Business Insider. And tensions are high in Indonesia, they say, as it appears that a months-long investigation into a $700 million bailout of Bank Century is going to end without any prosecutions of the country's finance minister and vice president, who the people blame for bailing out this bank. Now, the people are out in the streets protesting their government paying the bankers on their behalf.
All right, so Indonesia, welcome to the global insurrection against banking occupation. Greece, Ireland, Iceland, Indonesia, it's getting bigger. It's getting bigger, y'all.
Well, it takes me to another place where it could be bigger. Bailout will cause revolution on streets. This is from Ireland. Anglo-Irish Bank apparently needs 6 billion euros, according to the article. They've already received 1 billion. And Finance Minister Brian Lenihan suggests that they might have to bail out the bank. They're considering it. But, of course, if they're saying that they're going to consider it, they are going to do it. Now, Enda Kenny says, he's a politician there, and he says that Anglo-Irish is a dead bank which will not lend any more money. I put it to you, there will be revolution in the streets if you bail them out.
Yeah, you thought the troubles were bad before. Wait till you watch this one. We've been to Dublin several times, and the people there blame themselves. They say, oh, we shouldn't have speculated on the real estate so much. That's completely false because it was an asymmetric trade. The people who made the loans to the speculators then sold the loans on to other banks. And this was a mismatch in the economic underpinnings of the crash. And the people had nothing to do with it. The people are absolutely right to revolt.
Well, Ireland is famous for throwing off one occupier, which is the British Empire, and only to be occupied clearly by another empire, which is the global financial system, which is, these are a small group of very elite bankers who have no allegiance to any country and are able to decimate country after country, whether it's Greece or Latvia or Ukraine or Dubai or anywhere.
That's right. And the sleeping giant remains the United States of America, where people are still kind of satisfied with the cheap donuts.
Well, and then I have this headline, and it got me thinking that it might be an idea for these bankers. There's a trend we might see with the bankers, is U.S. diplomats add a moat to their expenses at $1 billion London embassy. So occupying all these countries around the world gets more and more expensive. You saw that, and you can see that throughout the Middle East, where all the crusaders went down there and they, occupied a certain territory. But in fact, they had to hide themselves inside giant fortresses with little slit windows.
That's right.
And this is like the U.S. now. So they're building a new embassy in London for $1 billion, which tops the $850 million cost of their Baghdad embassy. But this one, they're adding a 100-foot or 30-meter wide moat around their embassy.
Well, it's neo-feudalism. We've been saying this. The rich are seceding from the world. They're building castles with moats. And everyone else is going to be stuck in this no man's land with a bunch of Kalashnikovs and bad checks that were written to them by their former banks that are now bankrupt, crashed on the rocks of the global credit crunch, which is gathering speed. People say, oh, this recovery is not going to be very robust. There never was a recovery. Starting in 2000, the global credit crunch commenced, and you had it all the way into the present with a brief blip in 2009 as a result of Obama just flooding the banks with all their bailout money, which went right into their Christmas bonuses. And then they went out and they bought a few things at Tiffany's and maybe bought a few yachts, and that gave some GDP, a boost for a few months. But the generalized crisis itself is just accelerating.
Well, it's like what we were just talking about at the very first headline. North Tyneside High Street revived by fake shopfront. So this is the global economy, but in reality, it ends with the last one, which is giant moats being built around the people extracting all the wealth.
Well, as Warren Buffett said, if you sit down to a poker game and you don't know who the chump is, you're the chump. Thanks so much, Stacy Herbert.
Thank you, Max.
When we come back, investigative journalist Greg Palast.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Greg Palast is the best-selling author of Armed Madhouse. He's also an investigative journalist for the BBC. Among others, his website is gregpalast.com. Greg, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hey, Max. Glad to be with you.
Greg, you are a former corporate fraud and racketeering investigator. The question I have, is there a RICO case to be made against the Wall Street banks, regulators, politicians, rating agencies, fund managers, etc.? Isn't this an example of racketeering, and shouldn't we go after them using RICO?
Absolutely. I was one of the first guys to apply RICO, the anti-racketeering laws, to corporate crime, big corporations. And absolutely, what you see among the banks is a conspiracy, and I don't say that in the nutcase form, but just, these guys do get together and coordinate how they can suck money out of your pocket. And then obviously a tremendous amount of damage to the economy. And, it's perfect racketeering case, But who's going to bring it, Max?
Okay,
You
so
know,
in other words,
they're going to bust themselves. Is the administration going to read its rights to itself, or how do we do that?
right, so it's not a conspiracy theory. This is actually a conspiracy. And the conspiracy involves participants like the rating agencies, Moody's and S&P. It involves the investment banks. It involves the fund managers who are trading on this information. And all of these component parts, I see very frustrating. I watch congressional testimony. And first they introduce the CEOs of the what I call the financial terrorists on Wall Street. Then they interview the rating agencies and ask what went wrong. Then they interview some famous fund manager like John Paulson and ask him what went wrong. Well, how come they don't connect the dots and say that they're all corrupt? It's a massive conspiracy. It's racketeering is what it is. And they need to address it as such. Isn't there a mechanism within the U.S. government that could apply this racketeering law? You're saying it doesn't exist. There is nobody. They're all corrupt. There is nobody left. There's no untouchables left.
Well, we have a Securities Exchange Commission which was completely asleep at the switch. And they couldn't even get a guy like Madoff who was fiddling $50 billion. This stuff is more sophisticated. You know, they looked at Anthony Mazzillo, who's the only guy that they seem to have tagged at all, who ran the countrywide subprime mortgage gangster operation, which became part of Bank of America. But,
right.
You know, it was really a unit of Bank of America effectively. And so why is Bank of America off the hook? When you have a conspiracy, it's usually with someone. Why is the co-conspirator not in the dock there?
Right.
We also have the rating agencies, as you said, which were paid by the banks to basically whitewash their balance sheets. You know, I mean, you're looking at a guy, I guess this might take me down a few pegs in your estimation, but, you know, would you like to buy some of my Lehman bonds, Max? It was, by the way, it was AA+ rated. So, yeah, I think I have a bone to pick with these guys, and it's not just, bad judgment.
Wait a minute. You got sucked into this? You own some of these Lehman paper?
Well, because I got to tell you that Citibank, unfortunately, where I stupidly had my money instead of a community credit union, shame on me. They wouldn't let me trade in oil when oil was too high. I wanted to take it. I wanted to bid against oil. And they said, no, that's too dangerous. You need to put it in someplace safe. So they parked it for me temporarily in Lehman Brothers, and the rest is wallpaper.
All right, let's move on. You've also reported extensively on vulture funds. These funds are now starting to target Western nations. We know they've been active outside of the West. We see that with Greece, for example. Can you explain to the audience what a vulture fund does, what it will mean to have economic carcasses torn apart by one of these funds in Greece, Iceland, and the rest of these countries, including the U.S.?
Yeah, well, these are funds. These are operators who take advantage of economic chaos, mayhem. In fact, I just came back from Liberia, where I had done a report hunting down American vultures who had seized the debt of Liberia, some of it for nothing, some of it for 1 penny on the dollar, sued Liberia in the middle of a civil war when they had no government to respond, won tens of millions of dollars in default judgments, and now are basically sucking up the aid money meant for Liberia. Now, that's how they treat the third world. We're used to that. But I got to tell you, they are turning it now on the U.S., they're turning it on Greece, they're turning it on other countries where basically financiers make money on the demise of economies instead of on the growth of economies. They're not investing in anything. What they're doing is they're seizing financial assets, and they are doing their level best to make sure that the countries collapse. They can then pick up the paper, they can pick up the bonds, the debts for next to nothing, and then they find ways. We found ways through bribery, through intimidation, blackmail, and hiring Henry Kissinger, which wraps it all up, hiring Henry Kissinger to then use political muscle to get paid out of the poorest nation's accounts, or in some cases they'll take seize aid money. In the case of Greece, you've got a bunch of financiers who say, pay up at a tremendous price, or we take the economy down. You have to understand, these countries are paying you serious rates to borrow to stay alive. Well, it's just like Argentina, which is being forced to pay 16%. Well, if you pay 16% on your debts, you cannot possibly stay in business as a nation. And now they're playing the game with Greece. They're putting pressure on Greece. And that's just one example. But, they do it within nations, too, whether it's on the auto parts industry in the United States, et cetera. You'll see vultures acting everywhere. One
Right.
vulture I've been dealing with, Elliott Associates, investigating for the BBC, made its money in the asbestos area by figuring out how to buy asbestos companies, then getting the law changed so that these asbestos companies wouldn't have to pay the victims of asbestos, of lung cancer caused by asbestos, and therefore the company suddenly became very valuable. So these are people who made money off of not paying sick, dying people. This is a vulture. The difference is that at least, the difference between a vulture with feathers, a bird, and these vultures is that vultures with feathers at least wait for things to die. These guys are killers.
Right. So the key phrase there is they got the laws changed. Now, when I was working on Wall
Yes.
Street, many times what I was told from my management at the firms that I worked for is go ahead and break the laws because we can always change the laws. And this is the attitude that they had on Wall Street, is that if they broke the law, it wasn't that they were breaking the law, it's that the law needed to be changed. The law hadn't kept up with the brilliance down there at Goldman and J.P. Morgan. So that just go ahead and break the law, and then we'll use the money we're making by stealing all this money from Americans to buy congressmen, to buy politicians, to go change the law. So it's part of the no-lose situation.
Well, in fact, I ran a story about why do you think they took down Elliot Spitzer? They've always known that he couldn't keep his zipper up. Why did they take him down when they did? The answer is they literally got him the day he was announcing that he was filing a lawsuit on behalf of every state attorney general in the United States against the subprime mortgage lenders, Countrywide, Bank of America, Citibank, the whole crew. And he was filing a nationwide attack on this trillion-dollar business, saying the entire business was criminal, was illegal. And what they did was they busted Elliot Spitzer on, they pulled out the file on him, and then they decriminalized usurious mortgage lending, predatory mortgage. It used to be called predatory lending. Predatory lending was like what loan sharks did. But when guys are making, like Anthony Mazzillo of Bank of America's Countrywide unit, earned over $500 million personally. $500 million personally through predatory mortgage practices. This stuff used to be illegal. You're right. You used to go to jail for this. You used to, break rocks on a chain gang. Now you get $100 million bonuses.
Right. Anthony Mazzillo, of course, of Countrywide. And part of the way that this whole Ponzi scheme works is that they're bought by Bank of America, and then Bank of America, to hide a huge Ponzi scheme, subprime mortgages over at Merrill Lynch, ends up buying Merrill Lynch. When they consolidate these balance sheets, they put hundreds of billions or trillions off the balance sheet, special purpose entity accounts. They don't include them in their balance sheet reporting whatsoever. They go to Congress. They ask for a $700 billion bailout, as Paulson did at the point of a gun at the end of 2008. They say we need this to bail out these companies, but they don't disclose that as part of their machinations, a part of the Ponzi scheme, as part of the racketeering and fraud, that they're holding back hundreds of billions more in debts. Now, a year and a half later, these same guys, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, AIG, they're coming back and saying, oh, we have another $300 billion in losses, another $400 billion in losses. We forgot to tell you about those. So they just keep basically holding the economy hostage. And when they, as you point out, Goldman, J.P. Morgan, Cantor Fitzgerald, they make money on Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapsing. They make money during, before, after. And now that they've run out of banks to terrorize, they're terrorizing countries like Greece. They're terrorizing countries like Iceland. And they're using the same techniques. They bring in the products, like the Goldman advising the Greek government to hide billions in debt. The Greek government collapses. They're making money on the way down. They're making money on the way up. They're making money during the transaction. So it's basically rackets all around, 360 degrees of fraud. And there's not a single entity in the United States, in any the Fed, the Treasury, Capitol Hill, nowhere, that's standing up and doing one thing. Now, one of your most famous investigative pieces you did exposed the theft of the U.S. election in the year 2000. Now, the question is, Americans respond en masse with vitriol and send in the troops outrage at the merest allegation of vote rigging in countries outside of the U.S. But when it happens in their own country, they don't seem to care.
Yeah, it's very weird. I mean, I'm the one who uncovered that during the 2000 election, Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris tagged black people as felons, criminals not allowed to vote, but their only crime was voting while black. That was the election. We had about 87,000, something like that, people excluded from voting who were allowed to vote. 2004, it was actually worse. It was actually worse. 2008 was the worst election yet. I did an investigation with civil rights attorney Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We estimated about 6 million people who were turned away from the polls who had the right to vote or had their ballots disqualified, especially mail-in ballots. We got 25 million mail-in ballots. About 3 million of those were thrown in the garbage. You mail in your vote, it didn't get counted. Come on. And we decided, okay, I mean, when it happens in the Ukraine, we protest, we withdraw our ambassador. When it happens in Peru, we say count all the votes. Whatever happened to counting all the votes? This is not happening in the U.S. We're not facing the fact. People say, oh, Obama got elected, so the election wasn't stolen. 6 million people in 2008 didn't have their votes counted, guys. That's serious. I don't care who wins or loses. Why don't we count the votes? This is a big issue. We're getting distracted by things about computer voting, etc. The big issue is people being removed from the vote registries. No one is talking about that in America. I have to report that on BBC or Max Keiser. Thank you for letting me do that.
Well, Greg Palast, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Got to do it again.
We'll have to have you back again soon. Greg Palast, author of the now classic, Armed Madhouse. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and Greg Palast. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.